As Halloween is approaching, I wanted to try and recreate a game that absolutely terrified me as a kid. Now you might be thinking, oh, he must be remaking Silent Hill or something like Resident Evil. No, the game that I decided to recreate for this month was the Rugrats Search for Reptar. Yep, you heard me correct. So specifically, the Let There Be Light level. This level absolutely terrified me as a child. I think that's because when you think of Rugrats, you don't think of something scary. You know, you expect it to be, Rugrats friendly and kids playing around, but this level just took me by surprise. There was such a spooky atmosphere in this level. There was no lighting, everything was really dark. There was these ghosts that would follow you around the house, and they made these noises that still terrify me to this day. The first thing I did was to create a character class for Tommy. So this would hold things such as his camera, the spring arm, and some basic movement variables such as turning and the acceleration speed. Once I had Tommy moving around the scene, the next thing I wanted to do was give him some animations. So I brought him into Mixamo and had him rigged up there with some idle and basic movement animation. Once I was happy with this, the next thing I wanted to do was try and block out what the level would look like. Within Unreal, there are these actors or objects called the BSP brushes, and the great thing about these is they have these modes that are both subtractive and additive. So, for example, if I wanted to create a doorway, I could create one cube, which has an additive function, and then create another cube, make it a bit smaller, and give that the subtractive function. Then, if I overlap both of these brushes, the subtractive brush will take away from the additive brush, which essentially causes a doorway. I then use these brushes to map out the entire lower level of the Pickles house. Once I was happy with this, I began creating some materials so that I could apply them to the surfaces. The great thing about the BSP brushes is that you can apply a material to each of the faces individually, so this made it very easy for differentiating between the floor, the ceiling, and the walls. In the game, Tommy uses a flashlight to get around the house and see in the dark, as well as fend off ghosts, so that was the next thing I got to work on. I found a torch model online, downloaded that and imported it into Unreal, modified its attributes so it better fit the world, and then created a class from it. In this class, I gave it a static mesh component and brought in the torch model that we used earlier on. The next thing I had to do was give Tommy a way that he could hold the torch. So in Unreal Engine, you do this by applying a socket to the bone of the skeleton. So with Tommy's skeleton, I chose the hand and gave it a socket and applied a preview mesh so that I could see the torch in his hand. I then played around with a couple of the attributes and the transform and the scale so that the torch looked normal in his hand. The next thing I got to work on were the ghosts. In the game, the ghosts are dormant until you get a certain distance away from them, and then they start coming towards you. If they get close enough to you, they make a sound, and if you shine your light on them, they break up and shrink down. For now, I just added a class for them and added a material so that they are a little bit more transparent. I needed a way to be able to reference the torch in-game, so I decided to spawn the torch as soon as the game starts and immediately attach it to the socket that we created on the skeleton from earlier. So this would allow me then to hold a reference to the torch, which could then be used to turn the torch on and off again. Here I'm just cleaning up some of the animation because his arms are going into the model at the moment, so I just extended them out slightly so that there's not an overlap between his arms and his body. I then started working on the logic for switching the torch on and off again. I did this by creating a couple of bind actions in Tommy's character class and used a UE log which will output to the console anytime the torch is on when the button is pressed, and it'll output that the torch is off anytime the button is released. Once I had this working, I was then able to use the torch reference we got earlier so that I could access the spotlight component on the torch, so the intensity of the spotlight could be switched on when the button is pressed, and the intensity is then switched down to 0, essentially turning the torch off when the button is released. Once I was happy enough with how the torch worked in game, I then began working on the logic for the ghosts. In order for the ghosts to move towards the character, they need to have a reference to that character in game. So I set this up in the begin play function of their code. If this reference was valid, I'd then calculate the distance between the player position and the ghost's position, which I stored in a variable. So then I could determine that if I was a certain distance away from the ghost would then start moving towards me. Once I was happy with this, I started working on Tommy's aim mechanic. I found an aiming animation from Miximo and brought it into Unreal and modified it slightly so that it would better suit how I wanted it to look in game. I then created some variables so that Tommy could transition in and out of aiming with the torch. So the last thing to do then was just to finish off the animation controller. I added in the states for jumping so that you could only jump when you were on the ground and you couldn't jump when you were in the air. And then I also added the state for being able to aim. I was getting sick of looking at an empty scene, so the next thing I decided to work on were the assets. So I'm not much of a 3D modeler, so as you can see here, went into Maya and using very basic primitives, I tried to create one piece of the playpen that you see in the sitting room in the Pickles house. So I didn't put any detail really into this, I just used very primitive shapes so that I could get one piece, and I was going to duplicate that then to create the rest of the playpen. Once I was happy with this, I just brought the playpen piece into Unreal, applied a very basic texture to it and started placing them around the level so that I could try and recreate the playpen that you'd see in the game and the show. I created one side, duplicated it and created the other side then, and just played around with the attributes until I was happy with how it looked. After this then, I created the rest of the assets with a combination of the BSP brushes that we used to model the house earlier, and some free packs that come on the Epic Marketplace. So you can see the couch and the chair there, they came from the Vanishing of Ethan Carter pack. So I just downloaded that pack, applied some of my own materials to it and started placing them around the scene. So things like the bookshelves, the lamps, everything that you see me placing right now is all from the free Ethan Carter pack that's on the marketplace. With the assets that I had downloaded, it was just a matter of placing my own materials on them so that they better fit the game that I was creating, and just placing them around the scene until I had a one-to-one recreation of how the Pickles house looks in the game. I then started working on the power level for Tommy's torch. So in the game, Tommy can turn his torch on and the power slowly drains in it until he picks up a battery. So I implemented some code so that when the torch is on, the power will drain. And when he collects a battery, it will increase the power to match the amount of power held from the battery. After this, I opened GIMP to try and recreate the battery icon you see in the bottom left of the screen. I very crudely used the freehand tool to try and replicate the lightning bolt that you see in the graphic. I then gave this a transparent layer so that I could remove the middle portion of the graphic so that I could overlap this with a progress bar in Unreal Engine so that I could simulate the effect that the power bar will go down as your torch is on and it will increase as you collect batteries throughout the scene. Then it was just a matter of opening up the game mode blueprint so that I could create the widget on start so we would see it immediately as we start the game. Once I was happy with that, I was back into Maya to create a battery asset that I could populate the scene with to increase the power of the torch. So I brought a cylinder into the scene and applied the texture that we created earlier to it and cleaned up some of the UVs and modeled it until I was happy enough with the final product. I then brought this into Unreal and played around with the battery's attributes until I was happy with how it looked in the world, before finally adding some rotation logic to it so that it would spin in place. I opened Tommy's class once again and implemented some overlap logic so that I could collect the batteries in the scene. This was done by applying a cast to the battery class every time Tommy overlapped with an object. This was to ensure that the logic only applied to the battery and none of the other objects that Tommy overlapped with. The next thing to do was to add sound to the game. I started with the background music. I converted this to an audio cue and set it on the begin play method in the game mode base to ensure that the sound starts as soon as the game is played. At this point I only had the downstairs model and I was going to leave it at that. However, there was one thing I was missing. I don't know about anyone else, but I used to jump down the stairs all the time and it felt wrong not to have this included in the game, so I decided to model the upstairs as well. There are some picture frames upstairs, so I tried to recreate them using a placeholder image to give the place more of a homely feel, even though these pictures are pretty terrifying. I won't show much of the modelling process of upstairs as it was much the same as downstairs, so it wouldn't be very entertaining. I took the door and started placing them in the rooms and then used the BSP subtractive boxes once again to create the frame of the door so that they fit together. In the game, the objective is to find Spike so that he can open the fridge for you and let the light in. However, I don't know how to do any cutscenes yet in Unreal Engine and I'm not much of an animator. So I found this Spike model online and I figured I would just alter it to suit what I need for the game. This model was pretty broken. There was a lot of vertices that weren't merged together. I tried to clean it up as much as I could, but I'm doing the best I can with the very limited modeling skills that I have. So I just try to make it as uniform as possible and maybe update some of the broken vertices. I give them a new collar and things like this, just so that it doesn't look as bad when I bring them over into Unreal. I removed the really old texture and gave him a couple of 3D eyes, just again to try and bring it into a more modern version of how Spike would look now. I couldn't believe there was very little Spike models available to download, so I kind of had to do the best with this model here. I then put a very simple rig on this character because I didn't want him to just be stationary in the level. I want him to move slightly. So I rigged him up as best as I could, gave him a little tail wagging animation and made him move his head up and down, and that was pretty much me done with Spike at that stage. As I can't model the cutscene with Spike, I just put a big switch on the outside of the house that is going to turn on all the lights. I wanted Spike to be standing up looking at that as if to indicate to the player, hey, press this big button, so that'll turn on all the lights. And with that is the game done. So how do I feel about this? Considering it's my first project in Unreal, I'm pretty happy with it. There's a few more things I would have liked to implement. In the actual game, that you have a health bar and you can collect cookies to replenish your health. I didn't implement that in the end. And some of the assets don't really fit together. You know, I downloaded a lot of them from the Unreal Marketplace or from the model resource website online. You know, a lot of the models are really old or the textures are really bad, and some things I just have one material on. But hey, considering it was my first project in Unreal, I'm happy with how it turned out. I would really have liked to have been able to, you know, implement the cutscenes that are in the game, have Spike pull open the fridge so that all of the light comes on. Maybe I can do that further down the line when I get a bit more proficient at working with Unreal. But for now, did you like this game as a kid? Did this scare you as much as it scared me? How much do you want to see Rugrats Search for Reptar remaster? Because I know I certainly do. But yeah, let me know what you think down below in the comments. Like and subscribe if you want to see more. I'm hoping to do a few more of these, as well as Keith. He's gonna do a couple himself. So stay tuned for that, and we'll see you in the next videos.